My name is Joanne Conrad, and the title of my presentation is Breaking the Nature-Culture Divide, Sweden's Enchanted, Disenchanted, and Re-enchanted Forest. The domination, management, and plunder of nature by Western culture as a fundamental aspect of world systems for the last 500 years is premised on the hierarchical relationship of nature and culture. Discursive formations such as the North, the forest, and the wild, untamed, and primitive have all been employed to assert the domination and exploitation of the forests of Sweden at the expense of the local inhabitants, the ecology, the climate, triggering massive transformations and dislocations. My project investigates the discursive practices that have normalized the persistent nature-culture divide that undergirds and justifies destructive industrial practices in Sweden. My focus on historically contextualized representations and imaginations of the forest as both a resource and as a space of recreation, regeneration, and magic sheds light on the processes through which images of the re-enchanted forest were not only instrumental in the formation of new civic identities, but also shaped and continue to inform the relationship of the individual to the forest and to the state in the modern age. In the 1800s, as Sweden was transformed from a poor peripheral nation to a rich industrializing one, the forest became a resource to be managed and rationalized, processes which Max Weber and others described as the inevitable disenchantment of the world. The wealth generated from the forest industry provided the economic underpinnings for the welfare state into which Swedes were interpolated. Plunder, extraction, and exploitation were thus fundamental to the good life, but were for the most part absent from the public imagination. This is because the processes of urbanization and industrialization had severed the connection of the individual to place. In the reconfiguration of the role of the individual in the context of the modern state, the relationship of the individual to nature was also radically transformed. The forest became a place of the imagination, that is, re-enchanted. This forest of the imagination is now a taken for granted part of everyday visual landscapes, but its origins are part of the discursive processes of modern Swedish identity formation that took place during the fin de siècle. Among the phenomena at the heart of this formation were materials directed at children, future citizens. New illustrated children's books and magazines emerged in the context of industrial modes of production and consumption and were themselves commodities. These books provided a means by which the child could understand their place in the nation, another kind of imagined place. The most popular genre of the time was the authored fairy tale, illustrated stories of a fantasy world filled with magic, transformation, and supernatural creatures. But despite their use of traditional genres, which reference a pre-industrial, if also imagined, way of life, these new and importantly illustrated publications offered fairy tales of modernity, which contained lessons for negotiating modern life. One of the best known children's magazines from this period was the Christmas annual Bland Tomtar och Troll. Lavishly illustrated, it dealt exclusively with the fairy tale. From its inception in 1907 until 1915, it was illustrated by a single artist, John Bauer, whose images were instrumental in creating a new forest of the imagination, repackaging what on the surface were folktales of tradition. Bauer metonymically linked recognizable aspects of the old-growth forest to his fairy tale world in a landscape that could never change or be cut down, an act of mystification that informed generations and resulted in a kind of distanciation, not only redirecting attention away from the disappearing old-growth forest, but also supplanting it with a phantasmagoric double. There had long been forestry around where Bauer grew up in Jönköping in Småland. As a result, although up to 50% of the area is, quote, forested, almost none of it is old growth, the destruction of the primordial forest having begun long before Bauer's time. From 1906 to 1918, overlapping with his time illustrating for Bland Tomtar och Troll, Bauer lived near Lake Byn, only a few kilometers from Jönköping. Bauer derived his forest imagery from select locations around his home and from one rock outcrop in particular. The jumbled boulders, the cave, the moss-covered dead trees in which Bauer poses here all suggest a landscape devoid of humans, uninhabited and untouched, primordial. Bauer worked and reworked this outcrop into the backdrop of his fairy tale illustrations, reusing it again and again in different stories, including his famous illustration of Princess Tuvstar as she gazes down into the water after her necklace has fallen into the lake. Employing modernist techniques, Bauer's forest is reduced, abstracted, extracted from context, and serially repeated in his own body of work. And these images represent lessons and ways of seeing the forest in completely novel ways. Bauer's forest, the backdrop for a variety of story plots, has been rendered indexically to represent the forest, evacuated of meaning, repurposed, a space temporally and spatially remote, a primitive world of magical forces and creatures. The subsequent and frequent reproduction of his images in print and online formats, as well as in advertisements, reinforce this lesson. In the context of the evolutionist logic of the day, the rendering of the forest in this manner was to invite and normalize the development of that world, the conquest of primitive nature by more advanced culture. Many of the stories Bauer illustrated, especially those by male authors, reenact such conquest in what Donna Haraway refers to as the prick tale of the Anthropocene. Quote, the man-making tale of the hunter on a quest to kill and bring back that terrible bounty, unquote. In this way, Bauer's images can be understood as metaphors for the forest's conquest by industrialization, resource exploitation, and settlement, while they simultaneously serve to distance and distract from the actual violence. Bauer thus created a fantastical fairy tale forest world, not only as illustrations for children's stories, but in order to tell the fairy tale of modernity, which normalized a new and newly exploitative relationship with nature. This is underscored by how deeply Bauer himself was integrated into the modern world, working in the new industry of mass media and in the new field of industrial art. Photographs of Bauer recreating with his friends through nature clearly demonstrate this. Posing with other fashionably dressed moderns engaged in the quintessentially modern activity of motorcar touring, the industrial landscape in the background reveals the effects of ongoing logging operations. The car and the road sever the connection between the land and the individual, and nature is thoroughly subordinated to culture and progress. In other photos in which Bauer inserted himself into the landscape that served as his inspiration for his fairy tale imagery, posing with a doll amidst the boulders, the impossibility of the two worlds' assimilation into one another is made clear. Bauer dwarfs the troll he is holding. The message, the troll and the forest by extension are in man's hands. Bauer's images have an abiding presence in the Swedish visual landscape and have continued to circulate through the contemporary discursive machinery as part of Swedish heritage. The recent exhibition at the Valdemarsud in Stockholm, entitled Trollbunden, John Bauer och den magiska naturen, Enchanted, John Bauer and the Magical Nature, describes Bauer as having had a, quote, profound influence on notions of nature's mysticism and magical powers. Similarly, the Jönköping County Museum states that Bauer, quote, painted mystical and magical places. They're immediately recognizable for many who have spent time in Swedish forests, unquote. This again serves to re-enchant the forest, and yet to derive such conclusions from Bauer's imagery is to obfuscate the ways in which he actively constructed an imaginary landscape and to conflate ontological domains. Bauer's deep, mysterious, primordial forests are simulacra, existing only in the imagination, and to suggest that one can recognize today's landscape in Bauer's images is to reify the fantasy forest. The power of Bauer's images is not that people recognize actual forests in them, but that they recognize the forests of their imaginations, which have now supplanted the real. The imaginary forest is at the heart of the modern Swedish nature-loving identity, a space to which Swedes, as modern subjects, can return to an earlier time, to recreate and reenact rituals in the fantasy of a more pristine pre-industrial forest, to forage for berries and mushrooms and engage in other forms of ersatz subsistence, and to look to the forest as a source of spiritual regeneration, even as the actual forests are disappearing, replaced by managed tree farms. The imaginary and re-enchanted forest has also been at the heart of the ad campaign to promote green biomass technology based on trees as a renewable energy source. These ads, produced by Svenska Skogen, the Association of the State, Forest Owners, and Industry, consist of a series of visually appealing posters embedded into the heart of urban centers, in metro stations, bus stops, and park benches. The poster's ubiquity and central yet ordinary locations work together with their imagery of lush forest backgrounds to reinforce and fulfill expectations of how the forest looks. With stands of old growth and an overgrown forest floor, a fiction in light of the fact that most of Sweden's so-called forests are now managed tree plantations of non-autochthonous single-species trees or clear-cut stands. Svenska Skogen's imagery reassures viewers that the forest is still there and will be there in the future, pristine and unspoiled. The forest of the imagination is now a taken for granted part of the everyday visual landscape enacted in the embodied rituals and performances. As such, it might offer a potential space to renegotiate the nature-culture divide and to suggest more complex and profound reconfigurations of collective and individual identities.